Today we're going to launch into the topic of cellular respiration. Now this complicated picture that you see here is because when we talk about cellular respiration, we also infer that we also have something that's going to lead to that. And so photosynthesis and cellular respiration are talked about back to back. We're going to start with respiration and then we're going to go on into photosynthesis. So just stay tuned. Here we go. So respiration or cellular respiration involves taking in energy from foods and then taking that energy and converting it into ATP. And very often this can be called either cellular respiration or we can call it glucose catabolism. So this is a catabolic process where we take glucose and through a series of steps we do this conversion of glucose into the form of energy that cells can use, that being ATP. So as we work through this and we look at all these different metabolic reactions that are a part of cellular respiration, we have to talk a little bit about this idea of something called redox reactions. Some of you may have covered this in chemistry last year, but we'll just kind of give a basic overview of what it is. So redox is referring to something called an oxidation and a reduction reaction. And redox reactions always happen together. Something gets oxidized, something gets reduced. When we think about oxidation, we're going to be talking about removing electrons from something. So if something gets oxidized, we're going to take electrons from it. When something gets reduced, we're going to give that thing the electrons. So they always come in pairs. You have to have something that becomes oxidized when something else becomes reduced. And so this is how in biochemistry we transfer electrons from one thing to another. So we're capturing the electrons, which are really going to sort of fuel all these processes. So what you see here on this image is that if we take electrons from glucose, we can do this in a very stepwise fashion. So it doesn't all happen at once. We do it in a series of metabolic or chemical reactions that you see here till we get to the end. So we have something that acts as a reducing agent, meaning it's something that is going to pull electrons away, and then we have something that's an oxidizing agent too. And so we're going to see, if you just look on this little image here, I'll move me a little bit down, you can see that in this case, here's the reducing agent, here's the oxidizing agent, and what we see is kind of just a transfer, right? So now on this one, it loses the hydrogen, and therefore it becomes oxidized. So let me back up for a sec. So when you're looking to see whether or not electrons are going somewhere, one of the biggest clues to see that is what's happening to hydrogen. Because hydrogen, as you remember, is a proton and an electron. So if we remove hydrogen from this and give it to the oxidizing agent that you see here next door, then what we do, we're going to cause this X, which was at one point oxidized, to become reduced. So when you see things gaining hydrogen, that means that they're really gaining electrons. And so we call something that's gaining electrons something that's reduced. And that's kind of a weird thought, isn't it? Because it seems like it should be the opposite. But highly reduced molecules are ones that contain a lot of electrons in the form of hydrogen very often. So we'll see the hydrogen there. So think about food as having something that has a lot of hydrogen in it. And therefore, a food substance itself contains a lot of electrons. It's highly reduced. And then something that has electrons removed from it is going to eventually, when that happens, becomes oxidized. Okay? Stick with me. Here we go. So there are molecules that specifically do this. they are the agents of this. In other words, that they have a state that would be considered an oxidized state. And here you can see this one here is called NAD, NAD. And NAD, when you see it in this form with just a plus, is the oxidized state of NAD. And then it can gain an electron. We see that here in the form of hydrogen. So now this is in a reduced state. So what NAD serves as in a lot of these biochemical reactions is kind of a transfer molecule. So it can pick up electrons, and it can then become reduced, and then it can give those electrons away down in another reaction, and then therefore become oxidized. So NAD, notice it has a plus here, which means, as you know, it has a positive charge. That means it's missing one electron to start with. But if you put this hydrogen on it, so now we don't see the plus charge anymore, and we have the hydrogen, what that really means is that it gained 2 electrons. One of those electrons took that plus sign away, and the other electron is coming along with the hydrogen that we see on this molecule here now. So NAD is an electron carrier because NAD plus is going to accept electrons from these different reactions that are taking electrons from some substance. And then NADH has the capability of giving electrons. So it just is kind of an intermediate thing within these different reactions. So here's an example. Well, it's not actually an example, so let me back up. This is an example of what happens when we use ATP. So we know ATP is really important in all cells. Our cells are always trying to make more ATP because we're active, right? So we're using ATP. But when we take ATP, or when the cells do, and they hydrolyze it. Remember hydrolysis from way back when we use water to break some bond? And in this case, hydrolysis is water is used to break the bonds, one of those phosphates off of ATP. When it does that, it releases energy. And then we're left with, so here's the phosphate that came off. This PI stands for phosphate. And the ADP is what is the other part of it, right? So when that happens, this is an exergonic reaction. Think about this as the downhill reaction, and therefore we're going to have some energy released. Now, that can be coupled with a reaction that is endergonic. And we'll look at this in detail again. So remember, endergonic reactions don't move forward unless they have energy supplied, because these are the uphill reactions. These are not spontaneous, in other words. So we can couple these two, a reaction that's endergonic with this hydrolysis of ATP, which is exergonic, in order to provide the energy to move a reaction forward. When a phosphate group is lost, we call that dephosphorylation. So in ATP, when we convert ATP, or when that ATP is hydrolyzed with water and eventually becomes ADP, that's going to be a dephosphorylation process. But when that phosphate is added to something else, that's called phosphorylation. So here in this image you see above, we have some molecule that doesn't have anything, but we're going to drive it this direction. When I say drive, I mean the reaction's going from left to right. ATP was hydrolyzed here. Exergonic reaction, we released some energy here, and that phosphate is placed on this molecule right here that you can see. So this is a molecule that's been phosphorylated. And remember, in the last section, we said sometimes this is a way of activating enzymes too. Now, phosphorylated molecules tend to be, let me get this so you can see it, less stable. I'm kind of down at the bottom. Less stable, and therefore they're going to be more likely to react. So it's kind of putting them in a much more unstable position that way, and that's what we're trying to do in certain cases. A lot of the ATP, some of it is generated in the cytoplasm of a cell, and some of the energy, the majority of the ATP, is going to be made in that structure we know of as the mitochondria. So we're going to see how that works. Matter of fact, it says over here, I'll move me again, 90% of the ATP is actually going to be made in this structure. So in general, just a short and sweet look at this, cellular respiration is taking sugar, so here's a glucose, the formula for glucose here, in the presence of oxygen, so here's the reaction, right, with oxygen. This is a combustion reaction, right, in a sense, because what this is we're burning a fuel with oxygen. So when we breathe, this is why we need to get oxygen, because we use that oxygen then as in this long process, this is the short version, to ultimately get some product, and this is the product we're going for. So this is a multi-step reaction. We're just seeing a single equation summing it up. So we want the ATP, here it is, and then as a result of that we have some waste products here, CO2 and water. So carbon dioxide and water. To get there though is, like I said, multi-step. So we're going to go through, and I've already posted 2 links to a different presentation that I do when I'm drawing, to introduce you to some of this, or at least the beginning, of what happens. And I call it a 3.5 act play, because Act 1 in cellular respiration is glycolysis. Act 2 is going to be, or this is really the half act note, so this is counts for 1/2. This is the oxidation of pyruvate, which we're going to be calling the link reaction. Then we go to this, the citric acid cycle, sometimes called the Krebs cycle, and it has other names too. And then the final one, which is called has to do with really where all the electrons go, involves the electron transport chain, is something we're going to call oxidative phosphorylation. So this is kind of, if I can put this up here just to get rid of me again, to show you that here's Act 1, glycolysis. Here is that half act that I said, so that's the transfer, taking a product of glycolysis and doing something with it so that we can then move it into something called the Krebs cycle right here. And then we're going to take the products of this, and that takes place, this takes place in the cytoplasm. This takes place in the mitochondria, in a place called the matrix. And then the final series of steps is going to be down here, where we're going to see the transfer of electrons along a chain, called the electron transport chain, that ultimately results in a large supply of ATP. So that is probably, I think I'll stop this here, and then we'll take it up from there. So hopefully that helps.